My name is the Cozy Representative, reporting to you from a scorching hot 90-degree day here in Boston, Massachusetts. Just lovely, just loving the sweat puddles I'm leaving everywhere. Today, I hope you're doing well. Today, we're going to be going over a brief history of the band The Hush Sound. Now, the Hush Sound were an indie pop rock band from Chicago, Illinois. They were part of the classic mid-2000s roster of Fueled by Ramen Records, and although the Hush Sound were way more of an indie pop band, musically they existed in the same world as Fall Out Boy and Panic at the Disco and The Academy Is, when all of those emo pop punk bands were, blowing up on MTV and whatnot in the mid to late 2000s. I often think of this era as Fueled by Ramen as kind of an island of misfit toys type record label roster, with acts like Gym Class Heroes and Cobra Starship, who were truly unique, one-of-a-kind artists who wouldn't have necessarily made sense on other labels at the time. Fueled by Ramen served as a home for these sort of outlier scene bands, and the Hush Sound are a perfect example of this. Real indie rock people didn't embrace them because they had, been tainted by their Pete Wentz affiliation.
He forwarded the information to Pete from Fall Out Boy, who ended up getting his hands on it. And
Pete said something like, "This band, there's a good band in Chicago I haven't heard about. That's not possible," like something like that. And then he sent us an email from his sidekick, which was like, "I am in band Fall Out Boy. I am interested in band of yours."
No indie cred there, but somehow they made a real name for themselves in the emo world at the time. It seems like all of the Hush Sound fans at that time started out as Fall Out Boy fans and then got into the Hush Sound through that. Even though the only thing that the Hush Sound really actually had in common with a band like Fall Out Boy was the super melodic nature of the vocals, maybe made it kind of palatable to Fall Out Boy fans. They had a little bit of a sprinkling of emo on there. Maybe it's just a testament to how good of a tastemaker Pete Wentz was at the time, but we're not here to talk about Pete Wentz today. The Hush Sound were an indie pop band through and through, and were a true anomaly in the Fueled by Ramen emo pop punk world at the time. And not only is that in itself a really interesting thing about them, but the reason that I'm making this video is because, on a whim, I have been re-listening to and rediscovering the Hush Sound on a major level recently. It's summertime now, as I said, it's hot out, and the Hush Sound are like the perfect band to listen to in this weather when it's like first getting to summertime, so maybe that's why they've creeped back into my regular listening rotation lately, I don't know. They were one of my favorite bands growing up. I listened to them religiously in like middle school. I saw them a bunch of times live back in the day. I was a huge fan, and I haven't really gone back and listened to them in forever until just recently, and my god, I forgot how fucking good this band is. Like, they were really, really skilled songwriters, and very, very talented musicians, just really good at their instruments and really well-versed and advanced in the craft of, like, real songwriting.
We set the wrong course and headed due north. That's where
it wasn't some teenage, like, messy burst of heartsick emotion like most of the other emo acts who they were associated with. Like, this band was talented. They had done their homework as far as, like, how to write a real classic song, They made 3 seriously great records, never diminished in quality either. Each record seemed to see the Hush Sound get better and stronger as they went along. They were also pretty short-lived, too. They only existed from 2004 until 2008, an extremely short 4 years, and instead of letting their band kind of burn out over time and die some sort of slow, painful death like a lot of bands tend to do, they quit while they were on top and also while they were at their best, leaving them existing as a real relic of a specific era, specific time period, and maintaining their, well, should be, in my opinion, should be classic status. And yes, they technically did reunite in 2012, and they've played a bunch of like reunion shows since then. I think they also made an EP in 2013. They're technically still active according to their Wikipedia page, but as far as I'm concerned, the real run of their band was the original classic era, which ended in 2008. I just fucking love this band so much. I've been listening to them so much recently, and I just wanted to make this little video to, you know, pay homage to them in my own way and pay my respects to a seriously underappreciated band. So the Hush Sound story begins. I also got to apologize real quick. It's fucking, like I said, it's hot out here, man. I might just keep getting sweatier and sweatier throughout this video. My apologies. Anyway, the Hush Sound story begins in suburban Chicago, Illinois in the year of 2004, where we find a 19-year-old scenester named Bob Morris, who at the time played guitar in a local Chicago pop-punk band called The Audition. Now, while Bob was in The Audition, the band released the All in Your Head EP in 2004, which was recorded by Brian Zieski. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that last name right, but let's say Zieski. Brian Zieski at the Gallery of Carpet Studios, the same producer and studio which produced The Academy Is' first EP, called The Academy EP that same year. Much like The Academy Is at the time, The Audition were making some serious waves in the local Chicago scene. However, citing musical differences as the reason, Bob Morris left The Audition not that long after the release of their 2004 EP. Bob once stated in an interview, quote, "The Audition is a cool band and are still really good friends of mine. It just wasn't for me," he asserts. "We created some buzz together and it was a lot of fun, but I love older music and it's too different from what I love." The Audition ended up replacing Bob on guitar and also got a new lead singer before they eventually signed to Victory Records, actually, where they released some great records like 2005's Controversy Loves Company and 2008's Champion to moderate success in the scene. After leaving The Audition, Bob wanted to start a new project, which would be more, you know, reflective of his main personal musical influences. From there, he met up with his friend Greta Salpeter, a classical pianist who Bob had known for quite some time after meeting in school, when Bob was apparently in 10th grade and Greta was in 7th grade. Bob had always admired Greta's talent on the piano and also her songwriting ability. She would show him songs that she would write, and he would, you know, he really liked them. So he reached out to her and they decided to form a new project, The Hush Sound, in late 2004. Fun fact, I think they were actually originally just called The Hush, but there was like a rapper called The Hush or something, or some other band called The Hush. There's somewhere online it says it's a rapper, I don't know, but they had to change it to The Hush Sound, but they were originally called The Hush. They started playing with a drummer, a local guy from the music scene named Darren Wilson, who they knew from another local band called Until Sundown. Before they decided they needed to bring in a bass player to round out their sound, so Darren suggested they bring in Chris Fowler, who also played with him in Until Sundown, and with that, the Hush Sound was born. You see, Bob had already made a lot of connections in the scene through being in The Audition, so the Hush Sound began playing a bunch of good local shows at places like the Metro in Chicago, and they already had some, you know, decent local buzz under their belt just from Bob having been in The Audition, and this being his new project. And it helped that they came right out of the gate with some great music, too. And considering this was around the time where Fall Out Boy and The Academy Is and The Audition, you know, all these pop-punk bands from Chicago were all starting to blow up at the same time, the fact that the Hush Sound were bringing to the table a more mellow, indie pop rock kind of vibe with their music, you know, which was different from what other bands in the Chicago scene were doing at the time. From what I understand, it was probably starting to get a little oversaturated with pop punk and emo stuff. So the Hush Sound really doing something different and doing it with such mastery right out of the gate really made them stand out.
My voice is an echo of places I don't know, the stories are brand told.
In early 2000, 2005, they released their first album called So Sudden, the name being sort of a reference to how quickly things were picking up for the band right off the bat. This record was also recorded with Brian Zeiske at the Gallery of Carpet, same guy who did the Auditions EP. This record was released independently by the band at the time, with no label support behind it. The band kept playing around the Chicago area, as well as starting to build up buzz online, you know, on websites like MySpace and Pure Volume, all the hot places to be at the time on the internet. Until one day, a few months after independently releasing their first album, something happened which changed all of their lives forever. So, Panic at the Disco. You might have heard of them.
Sit tight, I'm gonna need you to keep time tomorrow. Just snap, snap, snap your fingers to me.
A band who had, at the time, just been signed to Pete Wentz's record label, Decadence Records, which was a subsidiary label off of Fueled by Ramen, who Fall Out Boy were on. They, Panic at the Disco, were just a couple months shy of releasing their debut album, A Fever You Can't Sweat Out. Ryan Ross, the band's guitarist, apparently, legend has it, randomly found the Hush sound on Pure Volume and really liked what he heard. Much like how Pete Wentz randomly found Panic at the Disco online and liked what he heard enough to sign them on a whim, Ryan Ross basically did the same exact thing for the Hush sound, and he passed the Hush sound's music along to Pete Wentz, who also loved what he heard and ultimately ended up signing them, the Hush sound, to Decadence and Fueled by Ramen as well. So from there, the Hush sound re-released their first record, So Sudden, through Decadence and Fueled by Ramen on October 11th of 2005, and from there, life had officially begun for the Hush sound. Now, while So Sudden is definitely a very early, kind of underdeveloped version of what the Hush sound would eventually evolve into on their later albums, So Sudden is a fantastically unique and whimsical blend of indie, pop, and alternative rock with just a sprinkle of emo on there for good measure. Lead vocal duties are actually split between Bob and Greta, who both take turns doing lead vocals on different songs. However, the majority of this album has Bob on lead vocals. Songs like City Traffic Puzzle, which is just a perfect piano indie garage pop rock opener of a record, and Crawling Towards the Sun, which was the only single on this album, which is a perfect first single for an indie pop rock band in my opinion, are two examples of the Hush sound's masterful songwriting and their ability to make ultimately chill indie rock which still has enough energy and poppy melodic vocals to stand out from the pack and grab people's attention with something different. More low-key, pretty songs like Weeping Willow and Echo show off Greta Salpeter's innocent, calming voice, and also her amazing songwriting talents, and the Greta songs on this album, tracks like The Artist as well, really show the band veering off into more outside-the-box musical territories, which most, you know, pop-punk bands at the time wouldn't even dare to try, or couldn't even dare to try, because they, like, just didn't know how to write songs like that. While Bob-fronted tracks like Momentum or Hourglass have a little bit of a heartier sprinkling of the emo pop-punk vibe, enough to keep it rooted in, you know, Bob's pop-punk past with the Audition, but still putting more of an obscure indie rock edge to it, which, like I said, made it different. And while a lot of Bob's tracks are sometimes a little more rooted in pop-punk on this album, he showcases his own unique musical touch throughout these songs. The best example is a weird little song called The Market. It's a quirky, kind of folky acoustic song, which is actually, weirdly enough, one of my favorite songs on this record, just because of how, like, strange it is. Another standout song on this album is the second to last track, Carry Me Home. This one is a noteworthy song because I feel like it sounds a little bit more in line with other Chicago bands at the time. It kind of reminds me of early stuff by the Plain White T's a little bit, who were actually another band, you know, out of the Chicago pop-punk scene in the early 2000s. So anyways, you know, So Sudden started gaining traction once it was released through Decadence and Fueled by Ramen, and you know, Pete Wentz was hyping it up. That affiliation automatically gave them a leg up in the national music scene as a whole at the time. In fact, Pete Wentz actually gave a huge opportunity to the Hush Sound right off the bat, and get this, for the Hush Sound's first real tour ever in early 2006, Pete Wentz gave them the opening slot on the Black Clouds and Underdogs tour, which Fall Out Boy were headlining, and it featured opening acts the All-American Rejects, Hawthorne Heights, and From First to Last. All bands who were making serious waves, not only in the scene at the time, but also in the mainstream. I mean, not only were Fall Out Boy blowing up with Sugar We're Going Down and Dance Dance, but this was also like the All-American Rejects' real peak too, with Dirty Little Secret and the Move Along album, which they were touring on at that time, which had just come out. This is a big tour. It was an arena tour. You know, their first tour ever was in arenas, and Pete Wentz put the Hush Sound right on the opening spot. They played right after doors opened as people were, you know, entering the arenas. So obviously this gave the Hush Sound a huge push and a huge amount of exposure and momentum, no pun intended, right off the bat. And apparently, despite being so stylistically different from all of the other bands on that tour, obviously, they apparently got a real good reaction from the crowds every night. From there, the Hush Sound decided to push even further on their unexpected growth and popularity, and they went right into writing and recording their second record. And that record was called Like Vines, and it was released on June 6th of 2006, 6606 to be exact, spooky, through Decadence and Fueled by Ramen. This album was actually produced by Fall Out Boy singer Patrick Stump alongside Sean O'Keefe, who had produced Fall Out Boy's first album, Take This to Your Grave. Pretty cool. Now, Like Vines, although stylistically is pretty similar to So Sudden, is a huge step forward in terms of growth and maturity for the band. You know, it was more beefed up and also more focused. The band feels more sure of themselves and confident on this album, and it was definitely overall a way more developed and evolved version of their first album, So Sudden, you know? Like Vines to this day is probably the most well-known album released by the band. It featured their most popular single, which is the song Wine Red, an absolutely amazing song. It also featured songs like Sweet Tangerine and We Intertwined, which were two other of the band's most popular songs, like to this day. One of my favorite Hush Sound songs overall is on this album, the song Don't Wake Me Up, which features the most juiced up and catchy chorus the band had written up to that point, in my opinion. It also features an amazing vocal feature from Patrick Stump, who lays down some of his classic freaked out soul vocals right before the final chorus of the song. I absolutely love it. The quirky, kind of circusy track, Lion's Roar, shows the band continuing to push the musical boundaries and continue to lay down more of their unique, whimsical charm. There's no way a track like Lion's Roar was written without the help of smoking some good sticky icky for some inspiration, you know what I'm saying? Tracks like Lighthouse and Where We Went Wrong display more of the band's developed top-notch songwriting and unique qualities. And this album also shows Greta really stepping up and starting to come into her own. And, you know, she definitely, vocally and piano-wise, sounds more confident than she did on the last album. A great example of that, a great Greta song, would be the second track, A Dark Congregation. A real upbeat track, which has a real palpable groove. It feels like a great live song. And some killer piano chops on the song. Another totally standout song song on this album. This album ended up kind of being the real defining moment for the Hush sound, so to speak. This album is probably their most iconic and most classic out of all of their releases looking back. It received a very positive response in the scene at the time. People admired the band for doing something different and being such skillful songwriters. You can definitely tell Bob is like a huge Beatles guy. And this album ended up selling over 50,000 copies, which wasn't a whole lot compared to some of the band's, you know, Fueled by Ramen peers at the time, but that was a lot compared to the other sort of scene indie rock bands at the time, like, I don't know, Daphne Loves Derby or Copeland, or like The Honorary Title or whatever. So for what it was, Like Vines was kind of a big deal, and it really solidified the Hush sound's place amidst, you know, the emo pop punk wave at the time, and it also solidified their place in the hearts of many music fans, well, emo kids around the country. In the summer of '06, the band went on tour opening for Panic at the Disco with fellow opening act the Dresden Dolls. This was actually Panic at the Disco's very first headlining tour. After that, in the fall of '06, they went on tour opening for Jack's Mannequin with fellow openers Copeland and Daphne Loves Derby. Now this tour, oh my god, that is absolutely the perfect tour lineup. I just tweeted about this morning because I can't get over, I just discovered this tour lineup. Jack's Mannequin, Copeland, Daphne Loves Derby, and the Hush sound. If you know me personally, you know that I absolutely love this style of 2000s, like piano indie stuff. That's like one of my favorite types of music, and these bands, man, Copeland are like top 3 favorite bands for me of all time. Jack's Mannequin and Daphne Loves Derby are extremely close to my heart, so I gotta give it up for this beautiful tour lineup. If I saw this lineup now, I'd probably spontaneously combust. But anyways, this tour was also cool, not only because it's very bands that I love, but it also saw the Hush sound touring with more indie sort of piano leaning bands who sounded more like the Hush sound musically, so they were expanding outside of that Fueled by Ramen world a little bit. The band finished off 2006 with some tour dates with fellow Fueled by Ramen underdogs This Providence, another amazing band. I'm obsessed with their 2006 self-titled record. In March of 2007, the Hush sound went on tour with Straylight Run and Spitalfield, who are another pop-punk band from Chicago. Following this, the band went on a spring tour opening for Hello Goodbye and Boys Like Girls. Now, obviously this tour was definitely a big deal considering both of those bands were all over MTV at the time, so that was a great opportunity. The band then played some summer tour dates with the band Rooney before going in the studio to record the follow-up to Like Vines, their third full-length record in the latter half of 2007, the year of our Lord.
Sugar, milk, and molasses. So little darling will attract all the bees. You are the gazer, you are the attraction. Takes a little vanity to know what it means. I know it does, you wrote it down 100 times, but you say that you're doing just fine.
So, Goodbye Blues, the third album by the Hush sound, was released on March 18th of 2008 through Decadence and Fueled by Ramen Records, obviously. It debuted at number 75 on the Billboard Top 200 and sold over 11,200 copies first week. Pretty good. Now, this album, criminally underrated, man. I'm not going to say that this is necessarily my favorite Hush sound album. Like, it kind of is, but I don't really have, like, I don't want to say I have a real favorite, because they're all 3 records are so great in their own ways to me. But Goodbye Blues is definitely the album that I have been listening to the most recently and have been absolutely enamored with just everything about this album. So first off, kind of the general vibe behind Goodbye Blues, the narrative, if you will, is that it has more of a live band feel. It kind of sounds more like what the Hush sound sounds like when you go to see them live, or went to see them live at the time. It kind of feels like You're listening to a real band, finding a real groove, all in the same room, playing together right in front of you, you know, as opposed to listening to a record where everything was tracked separately. This album also shows Greta Salpeter really at the forefront and really kind of taking the role as front person on this album, or at least the main voice on this album. While the first album was kind of more Bob songs and the second album was kind of a pretty even split between Bob and Greta, here on Goodbye Blues, Greta actually takes over lead vocals on 9 of the 13 tracks. This gives the album a really cool spin and kind of makes it even a unique album in itself amongst the Hush Sounds discography. And Greta really knocked it out of the park on this album. She really, like I kind of said, she came into her own on the last album. She really came into her own on this album. Most of the songs are written solely by her. Her voice sounds fuller and more developed and just bigger and better than ever. She's killing it vocally on this album. Her piano skills are more insane than ever. Greta just absolutely murdered it on this album, and I have to give it up to her for obviously really putting her all into Goodbye Blues. Seriously, she's a queen. We stan. I've often wondered if it was like a conscious decision by the band for this album to be a more Greta album, or if, you know, if it just happened naturally, she just had more songs. My questions were answered when I looked this up in I found an interview from around this time where she addressed this and explained why. And she said, quote, "Bob and I both went into the studio with 10 or 20 songs, but the trouble with Bob's songs was that they were all different genres and we couldn't make a very cohesive record with them. We wanted something that was natural from front to back. Most of these songs were written for my solo project," she admits. "It didn't feel that cohesive at first, but once we got into the studio, everything came across as a Hush Sound record." And she also later said in this same interview, "When I listen to the album, I hear all of us, not just me. I'm hoping the next record will be more of me and Bob singing together." But anyway, my god, this album is amazing. The songs on this album show the band's most masterful songwriting yet. I mean, Bob and Greta have always been great songwriters, but songs like Molasses, or The Boys Are Too Refined, or Hurricane show the band sounding so powerful and in charge with their songwriting and their natural, groovy, in-the-pocket performances. This is easily the most developed the band had ever sounded musically on an album, as well as the most confident. Medicine Man and Honey were the 2 singles on the album, and these are both 2 Greta-led songs. It's really cool that, you know, all of the band's kind of bigger singles, besides Wine Red, all the band's bigger singles previously were all Bob songs, so it's cool that the band had some bigger singles that were, you know, sung by Greta. Medicine Man and Honey, 2 great tracks. Honey is one of my favorites on this album. Absolutely amazing, captivating vocals, and also a really cool, like, rockin' kind of swing beat on the drums, which is very just satisfying to me. I gotta say, too, all of Bob's guitar tones and guitar work in general on this album are just fucking amazing sounding. He was experimenting with a lot of, like, British 60s kind of tones on this album, and his guitar tones are better than anything that he had done before on a record, in my opinion. There's a real punchy aggressiveness to his leads and a warm fullness to his distorted full chords that adds such a great element to this album. The songs As You Cry and Not Your Concern are my 2 favorite Bob songs on this album, some of the only Bob songs on this album. These songs are very early Beatles influenced, and they're a lot simpler than the more complex songs that are sprinkled throughout the rest of the album. These Beatlesy Bob songs are also great examples of Bob's epic guitar tone. This album really has a shit ton of, like, personality, you know what I mean? Which comes in part from the fantastic songwriting, but also another part comes from the, you know, the live vibe of this album. Now, I'm never usually a guy who really cares about, like, album intro tracks or interludes or things like that. I think they're, like, rarely cool unless they're done well, and I feel like bands often half-ass, like, intro songs or interludes a lot of the time. But this album has an intro track and an interlude as well called 6, which I totally love. The band did not half-ass these songs at all, and the intro track is a really perfect, like, haunting, flowing piano intro from Greta, which transitions perfectly into Honey and really kicks off the record so well. It sounds like that would be so cool live, too, the intro on this album. And then the interlude track 6 is this really cool, jazzy sounding kind of thing. God, these guys were just such skilled musicians, man. This band was truly talented, bringing in so many different genres and elements and you know, and really doing them well and really making something, you know, it's not contrived or it's not like a half-ass attempt at like a folky thing or whatever. Like they really did an authentic job at doing more indie stuff and folky stuff, you know what I mean? Anyways, Goodbye Blues, I feel like didn't make quite as much of a splash in the scene as the record before it, like Vines did, but regardless, the Hush Sound were pretty much at their peak of popularity at this point, and all things considered, the Goodbye Blues record did fairly well, and more than anything, received a good response from the band's core fan base. Following this album's release, the band went on tour once again, opening for Panic at the Disco on the 2008 Honda Civic tour with fellow openers Motion City Soundtrack and Phantom Planet. If you've watched my neon pop punk shows that I've been to video, which I uploaded a few weeks back, you know that I actually went to go see this tour back in the day. I believe it was the first time I ever saw the Hush Sound, and it was an amazing show. The band then spent that summer on their own official headlining tour, which was called the Dance Across the Country tour, with opening acts The Cab, Steel Train, and The Morning Light. I actually also attended a show of this tour too back in the day, and it was an amazing time. So after this tour, the Dance Across the Country tour, the band actually ended up parting ways with their bass player, Chris Fowler. They released a statement saying that they were all still good friends. Chris just wanted to simply explore other opportunities musically. And at the time, the band replaced him with a guy named Mike LeBlanc, who took over on bass, who had played in a band called the Dead Letter Department. I don't know that band, but I think that that's a really good band name. The band went on one last tour with mainstream radio piano rock bands Augustana, One Republic, and the Spill Canvas before ultimately announcing that they would be going on hiatus at the very end of 2008. And with that, the classic era of the Hush Sound was finished.